Where did everything on planet Earth come from? How did life start? How did humankind begin their journey on planet Earth? Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Hudson. I want to welcome you to this 6-part series on the subject of origins. And we're going to be addressing those big questions of where everything came from. Those are the kind of questions that I was introduced to when I was a geology major back at UC Riverside way back in the day. I was introduced to the great world of rocks and fossils and the theory of evolution as to how we got all those things. I wasn't completely happy with all the answers that I was hearing, and actually I was led into a new area, religious faith. Today we're going to give you some evidence on the subject of where we even have a debate on where everything came from. Why is there such divergent views if the science should support a single view? Partway through this presentation there will be another video in which I'll be joining you, and also other people that are scientists and religious leaders who will be addressing the topic of the day. That will be our format as we go through our series. Right now, we're going to turn things over to our local hosts. And again, we want to thank you very deeply for joining us on this journey as we take a look at the great questions of where everything came from.
Without the microphone, but just in case. Oh, I have to, because we are streaming this. We still like for you to be here in person, so I have to have the microphone on for the streaming purposes. All right. So anyways, I'm Ed Santana. I am a pastor, but I have a lot of interest in the areas of apologetics and creation and evolution. I do a lot of research on those areas, and I like to share that because we live in a day and society where this is a real battle, a real struggle. I've done this before. I've rented out the library to have meetings for central locations for people on health and different subjects. I did this at the library, and then they got complaints. Of all the subjects, the issue of creation and evolution created consternation with who knows powers that be even here in Blount County. Right? Now this is not a directly religious, but I'm a pastor. Sometimes I may preach. But the idea here is to empower you with tools, or if you're struggling with this, right? Because this is for everybody. I mean, I'm opening this for anybody, even an atheist. They're welcome here. We just want you to be aware of the other side of the story. If you're a believer, I want you to be empowered to be able to share and to know what's going on. So if you ever have any questions or anything, that's my contact information. You're welcome to give me a call or email me. So real quickly, you've gone to school, you've heard it, you've heard things. What are the evidences? When somebody says, evolution's been proven, what's the evidence that you hear? What? You don't know? Fossils, right? Oh, the fossil record, evidence of evolution.
5 or 6 or 7 or 8 billion years, depending on who.
All right, so the billions of years that we have been here, right? So fossils, billions of years, okay? Any others have you heard?
Carbon-14 dates don't lie.
All right, carbon-14 dating, okay? All right, and we'll talk all about these in our seminar. All right, any others?
The Grand Canyon.
All right, the Grand Canyon, all right, all the layers in the Grand Canyon, and how do you get all those mile-high worth of layers, okay? Have you heard of Darwin's finches, right? The speckled moth. We can go on and on and on, right? These are some of the things. We'll be talking about these, and here's what's interesting, is that you go to textbooks today, and they will use these as illustrations for evolution, and most of them have been debunked even by scientists, but yet they still show up in our school textbooks. And so those are a couple of things we'll be looking forward to as we go to our seminar.
Didn't Darwin become a Christian before he died?
There's no evidence. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of that. And as we go through, again, I'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. But today, right, there's a 6-part series. At the end, we're going to take everybody's names, we'll do a drawing. We want to encourage you to invite people, right? We do this because we want people to be informed. And actually, I'll do this. If you invite somebody new, has not pre-registered, and they come with you, we will enter you in for a $25 gift card, Amazon gift card. So just encourage you and try to invite others to come out. All right. So today, how did this all get started, right? Today, it's a huge battle between creation and evolution, all right? And of course, we've heard about the monkey trials that took place here in Tennessee. How did this all come about? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today as we talk about the origins of this debate of creation, or did we come by evolution? And the struggle that we have between these two, okay? All right? All right, so what's interesting is the Gallup poll, and believe it or not, these were the results. People who believe that there was a recent creation. It's actually a good amount of people, 38%. That's still not a majority. It's a good number of people who believe that creation was a recent creation. But a lot of those don't necessarily know why, okay? The other one is theistic evolution. What is theistic evolution? That God used the evolutionary process to bring about creation. Okay, that's theistic evolution. And those who believe in natural evolution means that everything can be explained naturally, materialistically, through materials, 19%. That's a Gallup poll back in 2017. Okay? Now, what is science? There's some debate about what is science or the scientific method. Here's one of the challenges in this issue is, well, how do you define science and what is it exactly? We're going to talk about science as a scientific method. When you went to school, what's a scientific method? Anybody remember? Lab experiments, right? You do something and you can repeat it and you can repeat it and repeat it, right? Lab experiments that you do, right? That is the basically hard scientific method. That is a standard idea of science. But there are other aspects of science that we're going to talk about and need to be aware of, okay? So that's what we're going to call hard science, that it is testable, you can do it in a lab experiment, and so forth and so on. All right? But here's the challenge when we deal with evolution or creation. You cannot produce it in a lab. You cannot produce it in a lab. It is historical by nature. So I want to ask you this question. Think about this. If I gave you the best lab in the world, right? I know many of you are probably not scientists, right? But you've done some things. If I give you the best lab in the world with the most intelligent people, how would you prove this? That Abraham Lincoln existed. Huh? Abraham Lincoln. How would you prove, right? You had the best lab in the world and the smartest minds. How would you prove that Abraham Lincoln existed?
I had a great aunt that sat on his knee.
All right, you had a great aunt that sat on his knee, and we're supposed to believe you. Can you prove that in that lab? DNA? How do you know that DNA belongs to Abraham Lincoln? It could have been your own DNA or some neighbor's DNA, right? Well, there's pictures. Well, guess what? We live in a day and age that pictures can be fabricated. I mean, I've seen an AI-generated thing where there's a famous person singing. You put your picture, and it's you, and your lips are moving to that song, right? See, the thing is, when we deal with history, you cannot, without a shadow of a doubt, prove a historical event. And the further you go back in time, the more challenging that is. That doesn't mean it didn't exist. I mean, you cannot prove it from a lab, a scientific experiment. What do? Well, you're going to hit, that's what we call historical science. All right, what are the evidence? What were the impacts? What were the results? What evidence do we have? And if, for example, a lot of people will say, oh, Jesus never existed. Well, there is evidence that we can point to, that there is lots of evidence, not only Jesus existed, but that he raised from the tomb. Okay? So when we deal with the issue of origins, we're dealing with something that is not hard science, it's historical science, okay? Now, if I was going to tell you, prove gravity, actually, you don't need a lab to prove gravity, do you? What do you have to do to prove gravity? Just drop something, right? Okay? That is something, and guess what? Every time I let go, it's going to fall, right? Unless I create some other force to keep it from falling, right? It's like getting the tennis ball with the leaf blower, right? You put it just right? It won't fall because you've got another force acting on it that won't let it fall, right? So the difference between scientific, hard science, and historical science, okay? So the next question is, can science answer everything, right? And the answer is no. For example, can science clone things? Can it clone things? Yes. Now the question is this, is it right or wrong to do cloning? Can science answer that question? Right? See, science is like Frank Turek says, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. People do. Okay? So science does not answer everything. Science doesn't give you why, the purpose for it. It just tells you what it is. Sometimes it's obvious, but it doesn't. Can't tell you if it's right or wrong, whether you should do it or not. Okay? So to understand this and how this is so important for the debate. So for those of you who are believers and you're talking to somebody who's not, you got to understand this concept, right? And that one, you have historical science and you have hard science. The next thing to understand is, for example, why did pilgrims come to the United States? Freedom of worship, right? But not all of them did. Some came for other reasons. But one of them was freedom of worship, right? They were escaping the freedom of worship. Now, how the historian answers that question tells you more about the historian, because they can pick and choose the part of the story that they want you to know that fits along with what their understanding is, okay? So the answer has a lot to do with the historian than actually the facts. It all depends on how you come to it. We're seeing that a lot right now with Columbus. We just celebrated Columbus Day, and there are many who are honestly rewriting history about Columbus. Now, did Columbus do some bad things? Absolutely, all right? But did he do all the bad things they said? See, now you're rewriting it. See that, so the people who come and read about Columbus, they see the most negative things, or vice versa, depending on who you are, okay? You say, well, I mean, facts are facts. No, our worldview determines our interpretation of the facts, right? That's, again, science doesn't say anything. It may give you facts, it doesn't. It's scientists who bring conclusion. And in this whole series, we're going to make that point. Now, I am not going to prove to you creation. Why? Because I can't. It's a historical science. But the question is, what makes the most sense of the evidence? And the first challenge is what we're talking about now, which is worldview. How do you see the world will determine how you interpret the science, the data, the facts. Yes?
History is what the person who writes it says it is.
Well, that's the portion. In other words, so the historian, how many of us, when we read history books, actually go back and read all the original documents? No. We are assuming that the person hopefully read all the historical documents and is honestly and fairly interpreting the data. But depending on your worldview, it will influence how you interpret that data and how you present that data, okay? All right? So, part of worldview, and a very important question, what is your ultimate authority? What is your ultimate authority, right? You have to ask yourself that question, or other people that you're dealing with. If you are not sure about this, or if you're not a believer, Again, you're welcome here, but that's kind of the questions, right? What's your authority? Where did everything come from? That's an important question in your worldview, your large worldview. What is your place in this world? How you answer those questions will give you an insight in how you look at the world. Okay? What is your moral code? And I can add to that, where did you get your moral code from, right? What's your future? Now, scientifically, what's our future? Well, honestly, scientifically, it's glim, right? I mean, we look out there in space and there's suns exploding, right? And at some point, our sun's going to run out, okay? Now, they all say it's a long ways away, scientists, right? But even, that's what we feel. But how do you think about the future? How do you determine that? All right. Going back to the issue of fossils, right? So what's interesting, it was a minister who first studied and promoted fossils here in the 1800s, here in Oregon. He became Oregon's first state paleontologist. That's the John Day Fossil Bed at National Museum. And here's what he has. So the hills from which these evidence were taken, he wrote, in reference to the evolutionary record of the fossil beds, were made by the same God who made the hills of Judea. And the evidences are as authoritative. The church has nothing to fear from the uncovering of truth. He also said evolution was simply God's method of working and therefore not atheistic or infidel. Of course, we're going to talk about John Day was probably more of a theistic evolutionist. But the point is that the fossil record for many was evidence for Scripture. Okay? But of course, if you go to school, one of the great evidences for evolution is a fossil record. Same information interpreted differently. Why? Because of the worldview. And we'll demonstrate it here as we go through, right? So how we look at the world, okay, makes it for John Lee, what was it? It was the Scripture was authority. And so he interprets things from the scriptural perspective. And that's the same thing in how we look at all things in life, right? What is our worldview affects how we interpret the things around us in the world that we see, okay? So our worldview is critical. All right. In 1998, poll of members of the National Academy of Sciences, a group of thought and policy leaders in science education, right? So they did a survey. Remember we saw the survey before of general population? What is the worldview of most academics, scientific academics? What is their worldview? Well, let's look at what the research shows. Believed in a personal God, 7%.
That they are their
Huh?
God. They are themselves their own God.
No, that they believe that there is a personal God outside of themselves, okay? In other words, a real God that is personable, not nature, not pantheism, right? In other words, only 7% of thought leaders in science and scientists and science educators, 7% say that they believe that there is a personal God, a God that is like a personable, right? You can communicate, to connect with. Disbelieve in a personal God, 72%. Okay? Agnostic or doubt. In other words, they're not sure, but they don't think that there's a God, 21%. Now, what is going to be their interpretation of the data that they find? It is from that worldview. And so when you read newspapers, when you go to school and read the textbooks, you're reading it from people who are looking at the facts, at the science, from that perspective. And if we're going to be able to try to really understand it, we've got to be able to stop and think, wait a minute, let's treat the information fairly. The reality is that many of the early great scientists, like John Newton, were believers. They believed in a creator. No science, no sciences are better attested than the religion of the Bible. Sir Isaac Newton. Since 1200s, universities in Europe, like Cambridge, here only taught that God had created the world like the Bible said. Actually, all our Ivy League schools, almost all of them, started off as religious schools. Okay? Today, that's not the case. Most universities do not believe that. They believe that only nature, the material world, matter produced everything. Now, there's a whole dilemma with that. We'll get to in a second. You'll see a quote from an evolutionary scientist in a few minutes here. Okay? So here's Robert Dicke. He is I believe he's a physicist. An infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of understanding the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. All right, so he's responding this to the idea of the Big Bang, that everything had a beginning, because most scientists believe that today, that matter had a beginning. Well, here's the problem. If matter had a beginning, then material matter cannot be the answer for the evolution of everything, because something had to have started the matter. And that's the dilemma that they have. So it's challenging their worldview. Okay? This gentleman really looked into that, how all of us, and I'm going to say this is all of us, we all struggle with this. We come to something with an understanding, a worldview, right? And we interpret everything from that because of our upbringing, our family, how we did things in our homes, because of the school we went to, the church we went to. We all have a perspective. And this gentleman, Thomas Kuhn, he researched this and realized that even scientists start believing things and they keep accepting that because they were taught that. They don't challenge it. There's lots of evidence of this. For example, when the first person who looked at the chromosomes and he put up a picture, said there were 24 chromosomes. What's wrong with that? How many chromosomes are there? Okay. All right. Remember, what's the place where you can go get your chromosomes tested? What is it called? 23andMe, because there are 23, pairs of chromosomes. He put up a picture of them. You could actually physically count them, that there were 23, but he said 24. And for many years, everybody else just repeated the same line, right? This is what's called a paradigm. We start accepting a paradigm. And the reality is we all struggle with this. And when somebody comes in and challenges our paradigm, we don't want to believe it. So for example, most scientists believe in what's called a steady state theory. In other words, that the universe has always been, was eternal. What I find it funny is that scientists have no problem believing in an eternal universe in the past, but they have a problem believing with the idea that God's eternal, right? But anyways, that's what they believe until the theory, the evidence came for what is called now the Big Bang, but it's actually the beginning, that everything had a beginning, a start. And for example, many scientists did not want to believe that because they did not want to admit that matter had a beginning, that everything had a beginning. It just doesn't fit well with them, right? They didn't want to believe it, so they resisted it and resisted it. Actually, the term Big Bang was coined to make fun of the theory, okay? And so this gentleman did a study about why is it that people have a hard time accepting new models. And that's when he came with the idea of paradigms, and that we have to have a paradigm shift. And so here's what I want you to understand. If you're a believer, understand when you're talking with people who don't believe, they're interpreting everything from a particular worldview. You've got to take that into consideration. If you're struggling with this issue and you're not sure, then you've got to challenge yourself and realize, wait a minute, why am I interpreting this by these glasses, right? Yes?
Well, the Bible, according to history, took maybe 400 years to come up with what we see now as the Bible. That was at least 15 generations of people reapplying or rethinking what went into be the final Bible.
Right, now that's a whole different subject from here, but again, just like anything else, right, when you study and look at the evidence, okay, and yes, actually the Bible was written over longer than 400 years. You're talking several thousand years that the Bible was written, okay? But it took from the end of the New Testament to around the Council of Nicaea, I think it was, around 300 years before they finally settled on what the canon was, right? But there's lots, and again, that's another one. How do we look at that? We can research the evidence on that issue. And what we can find is that one of the blessings that we have as Christians is that we have lots of manuscripts. And all those manuscripts allow us to compare one manuscript to another that actually helps us know what the Bible says, that it wasn't changed over time. But again, that's a different subject for another one that I'm not, there's a lot of information for that.
Why do we believe in time?
Why do we believe in time?
The Bible strictly says that when the Lord comes back, time will be no more.
Right.
So there won't be any time. I often think about where did God come from? I often think about that.
Right.
If there's no time, you don't have to worry about it.
Right. Well, when we talk about the beginning of the universe, the fourth session, we'll get into that. Okay? We'll get into that. All right, so again, we're talking about worldview, right? How we look at the world, and we talked about the majority of the scientists are not believers, right? So they're going to interpret the data from that perspective, okay? Now notice the admission here. We have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism, right? What's materialism? Materialism means that everything that comes to existence comes from material, from matter. Remember I told you earlier, the challenge with the idea of matter coming into existence at the Big Bang, it's a problem for them because, wait a minute, now you have something that created matter that's not matter. So it challenges the whole basis of what they believe. In other words, when they look at the evidence, their evidence always says it has to come from material. That's materialism. A commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, no other options. For we cannot allow a what? A what? A divine foot in the door. Now, do you understand? Not only does he have a paradigm, he does not want to entertain a different paradigm, a different worldview.
He's completely rejecting the moral lawgiver.
Correct. He doesn't want that. Okay? He says, now, some people are saying that because we want to explain everything scientifically. But in reality, what does it cause? If you eliminate the option of something outside of material, then only material produces things. Okay? And again, the whole evidence, why is there a debate? Well, we got to understand is there's different worldviews. One worldview says, what's our authority? Well, we believe, because we're Christians, it's the Bible. What is their authority? Well, they say it's materialism, matter. Okay? Now just think about that alone and think of the logic of that. Okay? But let's look at some other ones, right? So, of course, Richard Dawkins is probably the most famous atheist because he writes a lot of books. But notice what it says, biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. That give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Why does he say such a weird statement? Why would you conclude that it gives you the appearance of design but not be designed? Okay, all right? Deep down inside, he probably knows, okay? But what is it? His worldview does not allow him to at least look and realize, wait a minute, man, there appears to be design here. And what do we know about design? Design only comes from intelligence. That is what the whole observable world. One of the things that I'll challenge you is, right, you're going to hear lots of information, but there's some things just as simple. Simple like this. Design, right, we can distinguish that. I'll show you a picture and you're saying, distinguish that. When we look at the observable world, for example, when that hurricane came in and did all that work in North Carolina, did it create anything positive? Did it create anything positive? Did it make anything new? What did it do? It destroyed design. Any explosion, does it create anything? No, it destroys things. If you build a house and you don't touch it, what's going to happen to the walkways, the driveway, the house? It'll start deteriorating fast, right? It'll start getting overgrown. It can get so overgrown that you don't see it. The natural observance, you don't have to be a scientist to realize that in the natural order of things, if you don't take care of things, they fall apart. Right? We know what design is. Okay? But he doesn't want to acknowledge it because his worldview does not give him that option. Right? Francis Crick. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Right? You have to tell that to the people because it's so obvious that it is designed, right? But why does he have to say that? Because that world view, right? And of course, there's lots of evidence of it. But one of the things, like the dinosaurs, is the way their vertebrae are made to be able to sustain such a large neck and all the weight is that these vertebrae are designed to interlock with one another. Okay? That simple thing is critical, right? You have to think of dinosaurs, giraffes. Giraffes have to have a certain unique way so that way that not only the blood can reach up there, but that he has the ability to bend and get things. You know, how does that happen by chance? If you're going to build a house, right, what do you have to have? You have to have before that. Huh? If you're going to build a house, what do you have to have first? A plan, right? But in that plan, you're going to think about, I want the bedroom here, the kitchen here, the bathroom here, right? There's a certain thought so that way when you start the construction, right, you know what it's going to look like at the end. How do you get this incredible design without knowing where you're going? Okay? Again, we'll talk more about this as we go. We're just introducing the subject. All right, so for example, what do you see there? A bunch of rocks, right? Okay? Now, if you look at it carefully, maybe you can imagine something, right? Like sometimes we look at the clouds and we see, wow, that looks like this or looks like that. But now if you look at this, did that happen by erosion? No, right? In other words, we know what design is. You don't have to be a scientist to recognize something that took forethought and knowledge that's not just a naturally occurring event. And that is something that's not alive, that's just stones. Wait until we come together next week. You will be amazed, okay, of the amount of evidence of design, right? The biggest and most fundamental science question of all will always reveal a world view, right? So understand that's critical in how we approach things, right? How do we approach life, okay? Where did life come? And we'll talk more about this on Tuesday. What is life? People actually don't even agree what life is. Frank Turek, scientist, he says, if you take a cell and the cell dies, he'll ask the scientist, what was lost? Right? If you have a cell and it was alive and then it dies, all the parts are there. What was lost? No scientist can tell you. Same thing with, right? We've been to a funeral. Someone that we love and care about, we see them in a casket. What was lost? Okay, sorry?
Frank's also a theistic evolution, right?
Huh?
Frank Turek, he's also a theistic evolution.
I don't know if Frank Turek's a theistic evolution. I don't know, honestly.
I think he kind of strays away from the 60s.
I don't think he tries to stay away from the debate. I know that, but where he personally stands, I don't know. Okay, but again, there's just no consensus of what is life, what is lost. Okay, right? They're trying to create life. That's the big thing now. Abiogenesis. They're trying to create life. But even if you have all the pieces together, what's life? They don't know. They don't have the foggiest idea of what life is. And that's fundamental, right? And again, we'll talk a lot about this and demonstrate this next week, okay? So how did life come from things that is not a life, right? How does a rock, and I'm using a rock to talk about materialism, how does a rock produce life, right? And of course, that we're talking about, it still remains a great unknown. Scientists don't know that. And of course, some scientists are so honest with the fact that, man, this is really hard, that they've come up with the theory of transpermia. And basically what that is that some aliens from someplace came to the earth and seeded the planet, and then that's how life came. But what's the problem with that? Where did they come from? Exactly. All you're doing is pushing the problem someplace else. It doesn't really solve the problem, right? Pasteur made it clear that there's no such thing as things coming to life instantly, right? When he did his experiments, he disproved the idea of spontaneous generation. Right? When Darwin wrote his book, he thought the cell was just protoplasm, something real simple. Okay? But Pasteur demonstrated that life doesn't just come spontaneously. But yet, a lot of scientists now reject that. Okay? Now, almost all bioscientists believe that there's some process in which life comes out naturally, disagreeing with what Pasteur proved with the idea of spontaneous generation. Right? So, if biogenesis, right, life from no life, right, the beginning of the first life, how do you get there? Okay? We all know there's a difference between a chair, a rock, in a plant, in a human being, in a bacteria, right? There's something totally different. How do you get from one to the other? They say that it is from chemical reactions, right? You've probably all heard this in school, the Miller-Urey experiment. Oh, they did this experiment, and lo and behold, they found amino acids, which is our building blocks for protein. They didn't find all of them. They found a few. And the truth is, they found more garbage in there than there was anything good. It would have been really hard to use that. Okay? But yet, wow, see, there's evidence that you can create amino acids. What we'll see next week is how far that is from truth. Okay? But of course, they point to that experiment, and it's still textbooks today. We'll talk about the Miller-Urey experiment. Okay? This is from The Guardian. But how did the basic chemicals present on early Earth spontaneously arrange themselves into something resembling life? How did we get DNA, and what did the first cell look like? More than half a century after the chemist Stanley Miller proposed his primordial soup theory, we still can't agree about what happened. And that's putting it mildly, all right? Putting it mildly. Again, we'll talk more about that next week, right? 1965, Robert Hooke first saw and identified the human cell, right? So looking at it, and to him it kind of looked like the rooms in a monastery, which were called cells, and that's how we get the term cells. And in Darwin's time, the cell was just protoplasm. Okay. Michael Behe, now it's a turn of the fundamental science of life, modern biochemistry to disturb. The simplicity that was once expected to be the foundation of life has proven to be a phantom. Instead, symptoms of horrendous, irreducible complexity inhabit the cell. It wasn't that simple. Actually, evolutionists want things to be simple, right? Because if something is simple, then it can come out naturally by chance. But as time goes by, we find out it's not simple. And again, we'll be highlighting that more next week. Okay? There are 40 trillion cells in your bodies. 40 trillion cells in your body. To get an idea of numbers, if you were to count to 1 million, one every second, how long will it take you to do that? To count 1 through 1 million every second. It'll take you 11 days. Now, if you go to 1 billion, right? If you were to count to 1 billion, one every second, how long will it take you? 32 years. That's the magnitude going from 1 million to 1 billion. If you were to count to 1 trillion every second, how long would it take you? 32,000 years. That is the magnitude of numbers we're talking about. We're talking about your body has 40 trillion cells with 200 different functions. How does that come about? And of course, the complexity of a cell. This is like looking at the lining of the cell. This is the idea of amino acids, right? Remember the Miller-Urey experiment came up with amino acids. Amino acids is what you need to create proteins. And they come together in a chain to make proteins, right? And so there's a whole process that you have to have amino acids to create proteins, that then create structures. And then you have other structures, and then you have even greater structures than that, or molecular machines. We go on. Again, just get ready. We're going to be touching base with that even more next week. If there is a pothole that science usually runs into, is assuming that things are more simple than they are. Okay? So why did evolution take hold? Right? The reality is, throughout history, there have been people who don't really believe in God, or didn't really give God credit. That's all been throughout history. But why did it flourish in the 19th century? Well, there are many factors. Okay, but I want to share with you a few that are big. One, the weakening of the Bible standing. People started attacking the Bible, right? So one of the questions that were brought up earlier, the Bible. The thing is that we know that there's a lot of evidence to support the scriptures. That's not what we're talking about today. But as people did not begin to believe in the Bible, right, they started looking at alternatives. The discovery of fossils. Okay, and people say, "Wait a minute, what's going on here? This just seems so different." The ignorance about the complexity of genetics, right? That Darwin thought that a cell was protoplasm. The growing belief that the world was perhaps millions of years old, as some of you mentioned, right? We talked about what are people point to the evidence, okay? The evidence is just millions of years old. This isn't fit, right? So all of these are things that came together in the 18th century, in the 18th, 19th century, that started to come around, and people were talking about things, because before that, the majority of scientists were believers, right? And actually, there's a lot of evidence to point to why did science grow so much in Europe, right? The Chinese had great inventions, right? The Muslim world, the Arab world had great inventions, but why did it really take off in Western Europe? And there's evidence to point to this, that all these scientists, they saw God as a God of order. Why do we call them the law of physics, the law of gravity? Because they saw God as a God of order who made laws in the way things operate. And because God is a God of order, we can study nature and learn about it. So there's a lot of evidence from their language that it was their worldview of a God who's a creator, who creates and orders everything and makes laws, that allow them to make scientific discoveries. That became part, as people began to give up on the Bible as the authority of their worldview, of course, don't discount the fact that people don't want a God. Because if there's a God, you have to be accountable to somebody else. And we don't want to be accountable to somebody else. But it's such a fallacy thinking, because we're accountable to something. If you believe in no God and you do stupid things, guess what? You're going to get the consequences of them, no matter whether you believe it or not, right? Okay. All right. So, of course, Darwin, in his book published his idea. He actually put a framework for people to believe. He went to Galapagos Islands, if you heard the story, and then he started thinking about this because those who were winning this expedition were grabbing the turtles to eat them. And the natives would tell him, well, you can tell from which island a turtle comes from because of its shell, right? And so that began to spark some ideas in Darwin, and that's when he started looking at the birds, and he got the finches, and he realized the different sizes and so forth and so on. And so they began to think, well, wait a minute, over time, the species changed. But the idea was, if it changed, right, with the survival of the fittest, right, natural selection, okay, if it changed a little, if you had a lot of time, it would change a lot. But I want you to stop and think about that. Yeah, that's a possible conclusion, right? Well, if things change a little, if we had a long time, they could change a lot. But where is the evidence to support that? That's just an idea. But see, if your worldview is that you don't want to see a creator, then it's easy to go down that path and accept that. But what is the evidence to believe that, okay? And of course, that's why he wrote the book, Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of the Favored Races in Struggling for Life. How we answer this question as to whether there's a God or not has incredible ramifications, even in our worldview and how we organize in this planet. See, communism requires the existence of no God. Why? Because in communistic thinking, even though their desires may be good, right, that everybody is equal and things like that, right, their motivation is good, but what does it require? It requires the state to be all-powerful. But the problem with that is that the state is run by people, and people are imperfect, right? So there are ramifications, there are racial ramifications. Charles Darwin wrote another book that talked about, okay, how some races were more advanced than others. Racism, modern racism, is deeply rooted in the evolutionary thing. They won't admit that, but clearly is rooted in that. Whereas the Bible tells us that we are all one race. One race. Okay? Evolution said no, some developed and evolved better and smarter than others. Okay? And that's a book that even Charles Darwin wrote. Okay? So that's how you explain how it worked, right? These simple changes, more complicated changes. Okay? Since the survival of the fittest doesn't change the genetic code of living things, all it does is make species fit. So what's happened is, as people have been studying Darwin, they realize, wait a minute, natural selection doesn't answer everything. So then when they come up with what's called neo-Darwinism, which is that mutations are needed to change. But, however, as we've studied it more, scientists realize that mutations themselves, right? Went too far. Mutations themselves is not enough. Actually, mutations degenerate. They may add a benefit. So, for example, who here is not lactose intolerant? Okay? You're not lactose intolerant because of a broken gene, right? The way our bodies were designed was that when you reach a certain age, you start producing a hormone that makes you lactose intolerant. Because that gene is broken, especially if like your Northern European background, right? Because that gene is broken, a mutation right? It created a positive benefit, right? You can drink milk and ice cream and not get sick, right? But it didn't add new information. It just stopped from producing an enzyme that makes you lactose intolerant. So what they're finding is that even though mutations at times may add a little benefit, it's not adding new information. It's not radically changing. It just breaks something from working, okay? Dennis Noble said, all the central assumptions of modern synthesis, often also called neo-Darwinism, right? We just talked about mutations, have been disproven. Right? Okay, so they had to come up with another theory. Stephen Meyer, the technical literature in biology is now replete with world-class biologists routinely expressing doubt about the various aspects of neo-Darwinism theory, right? We've already passed Darwin, we're neo-Darwinism, and now they're saying, in all the scientific literature, there's tons of people writing about it. You don't see it in the textbooks, but in these major journals of top-end scientists, they're talking about it, okay? Rarely has there been such a great disparity between the popular perception of a theory and its actual standing. So here's the amazing thing. The vast majority of the population believe that there's lots of evidence for evolution. And they've got it all figured out. The reality is those who really study this know that they do not. Okay? And there's a huge disparity between what the general people know and what the scientists who study this are saying, based upon an actual published papers. Just a little video talking about this.
Bereshit bara Elohim hashamayim v'haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And pretty much for centuries, through the Middle Ages, that was the single thought that people had about where origins came from. But then toward the 1800s, the age of reason that it is called now by science, the thought that maybe there was not an active God out there, and maybe the laws of nature was all that was in operation. So this skepticism grew about the biblical account. Charles Darwin was taught in a university, Cambridge University, that had this skepticism, and pretty soon the worldview about where we came from dramatically changed. Today we still have this debate going between creationists and evolutionists, and let's now take a look at the origin of this great debate.
To understand this, we need to go back to where science came from. It was a revolutionary new way of understanding our world. And what it did was it said, we're not going to bring all of our preconceptions into this. We're not going to let philosophers like Aristotle or somebody else tell us how the world works. What we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the world. We're going to use our empirical senses. That's our eyes, ears, sense of touch, those sorts of things. And those data that we collect using those senses, we will interpret in a logical way. And that was a very powerful tool then for figuring out what's going on in the world. But then some people added an additional rule called methodological naturalism. It said not just that we should logically interpret data and that data will drive our theories. It said those theories may not ever come to the conclusion that God was involved in any way. It can only be naturalistic explanations that we can come up with.
The idea of natural selection actually was kind of around in those days when Darwin was developing his theory. Other people, in fact, had proposed essentially the same thing, but nobody had had developed it in detail and with lined up arguments and evidence and made a case for it. So Darwin collected these ideas, and he credits reading Malthus on population over population and the competition for resources, and he was thinking about nature as a kind of a competition between different organisms, and then he realized there's more organisms than there are resources. So naturally, those who are stronger will get the resources and survive. And he played off that, actually an inevitable conclusion. It's self-evident that if you have limited resources, the stronger are going to succeed better than the weaker. But Darwin's real strength, I think, was in developing a series of arguments that rested on evidence that, in fact, this kind of thing does happen in nature.
Well, I would say Darwin is certainly an icon in science. He's respected, and his contribution is perceived as really world-changing in some respects. So he is one of the holy saints of science, at the same level as Newton or other very important figure, Galileo Galilei. Now, when it comes to the mechanisms that Darwin suggested in terms of what could bring change in species or what could originate new species, when you begin to look at the granular level of the theory that he proposed, that might not be as popular nowadays. Why? Because we have so much more understanding of the complexity of life and understanding of basic things like the DNA, for example, that was not common knowledge at the time of Darwin. So he could envisage a much simpler way, in a sense, or a broad sketch of what he thought could happen, but he didn't have a clue of what was actually happening inside cells.
Today, Darwin's views are somewhat under scrutiny, but it would be helpful, I think, to kind of dissect apart his views. One of his views was naturalism, and that view is under challenge. There is evidence, maybe there's gaps in nature, that there must be some kind of power involved. And of course, the intelligent design movement has used that and developed that argument that in fact there is something more than just nature. Another view of Darwin is that natural selection can account for varieties that adapt to local habitats. And I think virtually everybody accepts that. Then Darwin's view that microevolution, if you want to call it that, this natural selection of small changes, that accumulates over time to eventually produce macroevolution. Well, scientists have held to that very strongly because they were afraid to give creationists any kind of a foothold. But as time has gone on, the scientific community has kind of gotten wary of that argument, saying, no, we don't see this is going to work. For example, if it's advantageous to have a longer tail, well, you can get that tail longer and longer and longer, but you're never going to make a wing out of it. How do you get a new organ? Microevolution just is not going to add up to a new organ. Plus, looking at the fossil record, you do not see that in any way. Looking at modern experiments, you do not see that in any way. It just doesn't work. So at the present time, the scientific community, the evolutionary biology community, is looking for ways to explain macroevolution. So far, they haven't found one, but there's many, many, many of them that recognize that Darwin's theory doesn't cut it. Another aspect of Darwin's theory is common ancestry. And I think for the most part, common ancestry is still accepted without empirical evidence, I would say, but as a necessary conclusion from materialism. If you're going to have only natural processes, you're not going to have different kinds of animals popping into existence all over the place. You're lucky to have it once. And so if you have once, then maybe you can play with it from then on. But common ancestry is one I think is weakly supported, but it's necessary for naturalism.
The people who are molecular biologists and who are experts in the field of how genes act and how they function and whether or not genes get duplicated and what bacteria do with extra DNA if they encounter it. Those guys are often working on particular problems. They're trying to solve cancer. They're trying to come up with a way of dealing with COVID. They're trying to solve a particular problem. And then you have another group of people over here who are trying to show that evolution is true. And they'll hypothesize about things that happen with DNA, these massive gene duplications that then resulted in new functions. But they never actually check their hypotheses with the people who actually know what they're talking about in terms of molecular biology. So there's often not a whole lot of crossover in between those fields, the theoretical evolutionary biologists and then the ones who actually are where the rubber meets the road. So I think sometimes hypotheses get generated about how these processes could have taken place that are not necessarily in line with what even evolutionary molecular biologists would have to say. So there's sometimes a disconnect there. So that's the main way. They just ignore it often. The people who are working in problem-solving areas, evolution obviously took place. Have you thought about it? No, I'm busy trying to solve cancer. These guys down here, evolution obviously took place. Well, have you thought about it? Yes, I'm thinking about it very carefully. I think that this happened and this happened. Well, but that can't happen. Well, don't dissuade me with the facts, ma'am. So sometimes there's a lot of what are called in the literature just so stories, that this must have happened this way. Do we have any proof? Maybe, but there's no it happened in the laboratory.
Worldview are kind of like glasses. That's one of my favorite illustrations. But the glasses, everyone has a pair. Some people aren't as aware of their worldview as others, but basically it's the lenses through which we interpret life. Worldviews are really helpful in what we would use them to answer the big questions. Does God exist? Does he or doesn't he? However you answer that question determines a whole lot of direction of where you're going to go. Where did the world come from? What does it mean to be human? Is there life after death? Ethics. Why are some things right or wrong? And then maybe another question might be, is there a grand overarching story that gives meaning to existence or not?
So what we think on the subject of origins is entirely shaped by our worldview. And does your worldview include a picture of a large and powerful and caring and capable God? Is he able to give us a record of what's taken place at the beginning? Does he care enough to think we actually would like to have that record? All of these things affect how we view the data, how we interpret the data through the filter of our worldview. Let's begin to take a look a little bit more now about some of the positive images that Scripture holds about the God who created us.
So, and again, I'm emphasizing the whole point today is how we have the debate is a perspective of worldview. And just to highlight the fact that this affects many things. Why is it that people in politics can disagree? A lot of it has times to do, they have different worldviews. And they're influenced by how they do that, right? So forth and so on. But of course, right, we're coming to the idea of creation. In the most detailed definition of creation comes from Scripture, and that was the predominant view, especially for all the early scientists. Hebrews tells us, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. And what's interesting is that many of the people who believe in the Big Bang Theory are in essence saying that. They just call it that it was a Big Bang. They don't know what started the Big Bang. But what is it? Everything that is seen comes from things that were not seen, which is exactly what the Scripture tells us. They just don't want to see it as God, right? And so, we see at a time where Paul was talking with philosophers there in Athens. And he was there in Athens, and he started talking to Epicureans and Stoic philosophers about God. And he saw an opportunity to talk to them while he was there because they had an altar that was called to the unknown God. And there in Acts it says that Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all these things you are very religious. For I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship. I even found an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, I'm proclaiming to you," right? So he takes this opportunity to tell them, hey, I want you to consider another perspective. All right? And of course, a lot of Greek philosophers, one that didn't believe in God or believe that God was in all of nature, or there were several aspects. And so he starts talking to them, and he starts telling them about the God of the Bible. God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness. By the man whom he has ordained, he has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. This is an important subject. If there is no God, we'll see as we go, there is no really purpose and meaning of life. Actually, even many of the scientists would tell you, if there is no God, if we came from material, you don't even have a mind. You're just a machine. All you do is programmed. But if there is a God that designed you for a purpose, and you don't see that, then you have something greater to lose. It's a very important question that we need to challenge our society and challenge ourselves, right? But we also got to understand where people are at, right? If you're a believer, you're coming from that worldview. But the question is, what does the evidence point to? And in this seminar, we want to point to you the fact that the overwhelming evidence points to a creator, right? So when the people of Athens heard him say this, they laughed at him because they heard about the resurrection, they mocked him, but yet some did believe. But one of the things he was saying, that there was a being had made heaven and earth, right? He's not part of creation, he's outside of creation, just like modern scientists are saying through the Big Bang, right? I'm not saying I believe in the Big Bang, but what they're recognizing that all of this had a beginning, okay? Someone who can't contain in temples, all right? You can't shape him, you can't control him by your hands. And his divinity is above all natural laws because he is the one who made the universe and the natural laws, right? And a God that we are responsible to, okay? So how we see that, right? But some believed, right? So they began to have their paradigm shift. And how does that happen? You've got to be honestly look at the evidence. And that's what we'll be doing through our seminar as we go through it. Alistair McGrath, although I was passionately and totally persuaded of the truth and relevance of atheism, as a young man, I subsequently found myself persuaded that Christianity was a much more interesting and intellectually exciting worldview than atheism. And there's lots of reasons for that. Werner von Braun, religion and science are sisters. The one seeks the knowledge of creation, and the other one of the Creator. Okay? All right, well, that's our meeting for tonight. Next meeting is a week from today. We won't have time to go through all of it, but the little things the little bit of it showing will overwhelm you to the evidence that how in the world could this have happened by chance? Very important. Hope to see you next week. Remember, I tell you, if you bring somebody who is not pre-registered and is a new coming for the first time, I will enter you into a $25 gift card, right, besides the normal drawings that we do. Now, so we're going to do 2 drawings today. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the origin of humankind, and I'll be talking about the origin of life. But we're going to go ahead and slide up. We have this thing called the Wheel of Names. Let's see if we can get it to show up. Can you get it to drag up there, Alfonso? Yeah, there it is. All right, okay. So I've got one is a DVD, and it's calling The Unlocking the Mysteries of Life, which is some of this material we'll be covering next week. And then this is more on a religious perspective, right? If there is a God, which is the right God, right? And so this will talk a little bit more about Jesus and the evidence for Jesus and the resurrection. Great book called More Than a Carpenter, right? So we're going to give out the book first, More Than a Carpenter, and then we'll give out the DVD, The Origins of Life. And so go ahead and spin it, click on it, and let's see who is our first winner. All right, Verity. Here you go. All right, let's go ahead and spin it again. All right, our young people are winning today. All right, I want to take a long time because I'm trying to keep you from an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. We're getting close to that. But any quick questions on the issue of worldview and how we got to the place we are today in this great debate? Yes?
One thing I don't understand is that we're on a round world. How come we're always standing right side up no matter where we go?
It's called gravity. Why are we in a round world and everyone is standing up? Say it again? Does not answer the question. Well, that's a question that you have to ask a scientist. I'm not a scientist, but I can tell you the answer is gravity. Yeah, it's gravity. But yet gravity is still, it's not fully understood. How gravity, like the gravity of the sun or the gravity of the earth and the gravity of the moon, can exert such an influence for such a long distance, right? Like our moon is critical to life. Right? Without the moon, lots of challenges happen, okay? Especially with tides and other issues. But why do we have tides? It is the gravitational of the moon from that long a distance that can impact. Yep. All right. When we get to the issue of the creation of the universe, we'll talk about all the laws that have to be measured just right, that again point to a creator and design. Okay?
Up in Nova Scotia, the tide rises and falls nearly 60 feet.
Yes, in some locations it rises and falls more. Right? Any other questions?
You think
Yeah.
I think it's possible to be an atheist. Have you ever met an actual atheist that doesn't believe, that doesn't end up, I guess, saying that he or she believes in a higher power?
There are people, yes, I have met people who claim to be atheists. I know people who are atheists that in reality they're atheists because they have a problem. If God is a good God, why is there so much evil? That is one of the biggest reasons, non-scientific ones, but one of the biggest reasons for some people.
I've done a lot of, I guess, witnessing out at UT campus, downtown Knoxville. I've never heard, well, I don't believe it's something. They always credit to a higher power. They never say, well, I don't believe in a higher power. They just always give credit to where credit's due. With that, when they ask questions like that, I say, well, it was created perfect.
Right.
And, it's not God's fault that we decided to mess it up, but, it's just the same thing.
Right. And again, in this seminar, we're talking about more of the evidence of creation. I won't be going too much into, okay, if there is a God, a higher power, who is that higher power? Well, I believe who that higher power is. I was a pastor of a Christian church, okay? All right, so I know who that higher power is. And again, just like there's overwhelming evidence for a creator, there's overwhelming evidence that that creator is the God of the Bible. And it's not just because we grew up in a Christian world. No, there is actual, if you take and look at all the world philosophies and world religions and you start measuring them out and putting them out and you treat them in the same equal basis, what you find that there is overwhelming evidence for the God of the Bible, right? But that's the next question, right? So there's a higher power, right? And see, again, part of the challenge is that people don't want a higher power because they don't want to be responsible. That is probably the number one reason. And what I would want to challenge people like that is to say, but you're still responsible to the realities of life. Why wouldn't you want to be in harmony with the things that are going to make you flourish? The thing is this, if there is a God who created everything, then he knows what's going to help us flourish. Help us to know how to succeed and to have a successful, positive life, right? And so a God shouldn't be one to be feared, it should be one to be admired, right?
If he created everything, where was he before?
If he created everything, where was God?
Yeah, before.
He has always been.
Where was he?
Always been.
There is nothing.
There has always been. See, what he was interesting, right? And I've heard a lot of people have made those arguments. Well, okay, so who created God? Well, then you have to have another God to create that God. Well, who created that God? Then you have a bigger God that created that God. And you keep going on for eternity, doesn't it? At some point, there has to be one entity that is the originator of everything. The Big Bang, scientists now will tell you, it was a singularity. Some event that took place that all matter, time and space and energy, everything began, which is exactly what the scripture says. They just say it's a Big Bang, right? What we say, it's God, right? Now, what's interesting, before the Big Bang, I told you what was the view, the steady state theory, that the matter is eternal. Well, we have no problem with believing with the idea that matter is eternal, but we have a problem with the idea that God is eternal, okay? The reality of this, just some things we don't understand. What makes the most sense? But what do we know is that there is somebody who made all matter, time, and space has to be outside of matter, time, and space. It's only logical. But because we are in matter, time, and space, we're not going to be able to understand something that's outside of matter, time, and space. Right? And so there are limitations to our ability just by logical sense. For a scientist who doesn't believe in God and believes in the Big Bang Theory, they don't know. What do they call it? Nothing. You know, actually, you hear that great scientist, the one that is Stephen Hawking. It says, and he does a whole presentation, out of nothing, everything came. Literally, that's what he says. Now, of course, they don't, but it reminds me of that Sound of Music song. Nothing comes from nothing. But yet that's what they're saying. Well, we're saying it's God. Jan, then back to Monty.
Talk about the disconnect between the paradigm of the scientists who are punching holes in Darwin's theory and the paradigm of the textbook writers who are refusing to accept the holes being punched in Darwin's theory.
Okay, the reason of the difference of the two is, again, those scientists will admit there's problems with Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, right? It's all in their publications, okay? But they don't want the general population to know that because why? They don't, you heard it in that statement. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. They cannot reject that, right? So they are okay with misinformation being in scientific textbooks, right? Because they'd rather have the masses believing with them. Okay? All right, well, let me have a word of prayer as we close. Our gracious and loving Father, Lord, I pray that you'll be with everyone here. I don't know where they all stand in their journey. But Lord, my prayer is that all will come to realize that you are the one who created all things, all these laws, all these things, all the design. He created it for us. And there's nothing to fear in trusting you and trusting your way. And so be with us as we go from here and help us to continue to think about these things, to be able to hide them in our hearts, Lord, but also to be able to share them with others. For we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for coming. Week from today, bring a guest that's never come before. We'll enter you into a $25 gift card, and we'll have some other gifts as well. Have a good evening.